Yes, in this area. Audio is recording. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hope you're all doing well today. Welcome to Berkeley Covenant Church. And if this is your first time, special welcome. And if this is you've been here many times, welcome as well. We're starting a new class series today, and the focus is lies my culture told me about the Christian faith. And we'll be looking over a number of myths, things that are very culturally prevalent, things that I'm sure when I go through the list of things we'll be talking about, I'm sure many of you heard these things. They're just truths. You might have your suspicions. You might think, well, that has to be true. I've heard it so many times that I can't imagine it could be false. But through the next semester, through the spring, we're going to talk about why these are false, and go through each one of them with a lot of detail to convince you that these are myths. These are not truths, but they affect us. They affect how we talk about our faith. They affect conversations we have. They affect our own faith life. You might have doubts about your faith because you've heard some of this stuff. And you might be thinking, well, if this is true, should I be a Christian? Right? If it's true that Christianity has done more harm than good, that Christian missionaries have done more harm than good, then why am I in this faith to begin with? So we'll look at some of these myths. Lots of lies. There's someone's PowerPoint there. Medicine before the scientific revolution. If you can read it. It says illustration depicting bloodletting. And on the one side it says church didn't allow dissection. Illness was punishment for sin, and medicine challenged the will of God. So that's a typical sort of lie you see in someone's PowerPoint that's posted online. Right? We'll see why each one of those is false. The idea that science and religion have always been at war. There's Jesus, arm wrestling. Anyone know who that is? He's arm wrestling? Neil deGrasse Tyson. So you're familiar with the individual, at least some of you. What show does he host? Anyone know? Cosmos, a space-time odyssey. Right? And so he says lots of interesting things in that show, which is watched by millions. Like the church burned Giordano Bruno at the stake for his science. We'll talk about why that's false today. Right? That's not quite the case. That traditional Christians believe in the young earth. Now, that's the traditional view of Christians. Interestingly, in 1925, at the time of the Scopes monkey trial, if you've heard of it, we'll talk about that. No fundamentalists believed that the earth was young. No one challenged the fossil record. That might be surprising to you, but we'll talk about why that wasn't true and where that came from. That Christians once thought the earth was flat, or that anyone in medieval Europe once thought the earth was flat. We'll talk about that. What's that? Everyone. Yeah, right. That's the myth, but we'll see why that's actually not true. No one at the time of Columbus thought the world was flat. Every single person believed it was round. Even if they didn't have proof, it was an article of faith that the earth was a sphere. We'll talk about that next week, and we'll see if you're convinced. The church persecuted Copernicus, Galileo, and other scientists. Also false that the church forbade human dissection and actually encouraged human dissection. The Pope commanded human dissections and was the first one to do so. More lies. That Darwin was an atheist with an anti-Christian agenda. That 19th century Christians were opposed to evolution. That the Dark Ages were a thing, that they existed. There actually was never any period in Western European history that would be fairly described as the Dark Ages. Where does that come from? The Enlightenment. Right? So we're so enlightened. This pre-Enlightenment Christian period of history is this dark, disturbing time of brutality. Lots of lies about the Dark Ages. That's going to be a fun one. That Iron Maidens existed. If you know of Iron Maiden, there's a group, metal group called that. There's a comic there of the Iron Maiden that says, "You must stop torturing yourself, Harold." Right? So he's in an Iron Maiden. Iron Maidens were created in the 1900s, projected back on the brutal Middle Ages. Then people gave us the Enlightenment, gave us the Iron Maiden as a way to think about the Middle Ages. And If you don't have proof, you create it, right? Same with chastity belts. All chastity belts in every museum you've ever seen were created in the Victorian age. Not a single chastity belt ever existed, nor a reference to one in the Middle Ages. So if you have cartoons like this, well, I think he's a bit OCD. You check my chastity belt and it's lost 6 times, right? Perhaps you've heard these things, perhaps not. Medieval witch hunts led by the church. Not the case. There were no witch hunts led by the church in the Middle Ages. We'll talk about witch hunts and what they amount to. The witch hunts were specifically directed at women or women scientists or wise women. Lots of myths there. We'll see where these come from. That there's once a peaceful gods-worshipping global matriarchy that was supplanted by an oppressive Semitic god-worshipping patriarchy. Long sentence, but I couldn't get any shorter. There's a myth out there you see in books like The Age of the Great Goddess. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code goes into this quite a bit. And we'll talk about how this myth is all over the place, where it comes from, why it's false, and how it led to German anti-Semitism in World War II, interestingly enough. And so these myths do have consequences. Some of them mean destroying the people who invented the patriarchy, the Jews. Right? So Hitler was interested in this theory. We'll talk about it when we get there. In the class on Was Hitler a Christian? That's another myth sometimes you hear. The church and women is a topic we'll be looking at. Whether or not the church was oppressive to women as a typical sort of thing or not, we'll look into that. Was there a golden age of Islamic science while Christians were stuck in the ignorance of the Dark Ages? We'll look at that as well. We'll start looking at that one today, in fact. And Buddhism. Sometimes you might have seen this quote by Einstein. If there was any religion that would cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism. Some versions of the quote say, if there's a religion that's the most scientific, it is Buddhism. Einstein never said such a thing. There's no source for this quote. He never said it. Right? We never even had him talking about Buddhism. Right, so we'll see where this myth comes from. And we'll look at other ones too. Hitler was a Christian, mentioned that one. That Christianity is a Western religion. Christianity started in the East. Jerusalem's in the East. Most Christians before the year 1000 were east of Jerusalem. There were Christian rulers who converted to Christianity in Japan before England. Right? That might give you some perspective on the spread of Christianity. That the Christian church was responsible for African slavery. We're going to talk about the slave trade, slavery, the movement against slavery in the Middle Ages, who was responsible, why the Middle Ages got rid of slavery, how it was reintroduced. That Christian missionary activity did more harm than good to indigenous peoples and cultures. This is a complex one, but I think it's worth talking about because I hear this a lot. And we'll see some of the good things missionaries did around the world, right? Like getting rid of Chinese foot binding of women. We can thank Christian missionaries for that movement, for making it happen. Right? Things like that. We can talk about the Big Bang. Some people think the Big Bang theory is an atheist theory opposed to God. It was actually a theory that was proposed by a physicist and a Catholic priest. And the response to him, actually, was also proposed by an Eastern Orthodox devout Christian. 2 different people had this theory, interpreted Einstein's data in this way. But what ended up happening was they said, well, this sounds like theology. So the Big Bang was not accepted for many, many years because it was too theological. Right? So now we say, oh, Big Bang, that's atheistic. Well, not quite. Pretty much everything you've heard about the Inquisition is false. I think I could say that with not much hyperbole at all. We'll talk a lot about the Inquisition. It was a very orderly, actually boring group that actually hung people from mobs for attempting to burn witches. Right? Interestingly, the Inquisition was responsible more often than not for protecting people accused of witchcraft. Right? And we'll see who the accusers are. We'll see that. That'll be a nice little surprise. So we can start with a general picture of our reality. And I like to use Dan Brown because he manages to incorporate almost every single one of those myths, every single one of those lies in his books. You could just read Dan Brown and you get all of them one place or another.
And why does he sell so many novels? Well, because everyone loves a conspiracy. That's what Dan Brown tells us. Conspiracy theories sell lots of books. And he picks them up and he makes them run with his books. And a lot of these conspiracy theories come from the 19th century, Victorians, sometimes the French, sometimes Germans. But there's conspiracies that were introduced in the 19th century that were explicitly anti-Christian. Was the pen not working? Okay. I have another one if you need it. But conspiracy theories that are explicitly anti-Christian, introduced to attack Christianity in the Victorian age, and these have so many inroads in our culture that everyone in this room has been influenced by these conspiracy theories. So much that if you suggest that these are not conspiracy theories, you yourself will be accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Right? That's how deep these things are. If you try to question them, people say, oh, you're introducing some sort of conspiracy theory about history, when in fact these things started as conspiracy theories. And today we're going to talk about this one. Does anyone not get the humor of this cartoon? We see these people in the back say, hit it with your Bible and science is the candle. Does that seem unfamiliar to anyone, that idea that people with Bibles have to snuff out the light of science, right? Whether they're sinister, whether they're comical, science and religion, specifically the Christian religion, have been seen as not getting along so well. Dan Brown has his main character say things like this. This is a Harvard professor telling us these things, so, be... duly respect his authority and his academic integrity, because he's from Harvard. Of course, he's a fictional character. But Dan Brown says, since the beginning of history, a deep rift has existed between science and religion. Religion has always persecuted science. Unbiased science could not possibly be performed by a person who possessed faith in God. Right? And so Dan Brown continues. He says, early scientists were branded alive on the chest with the symbol of a cross. Outspoken scientists like Copernicus were murdered by the church for revealing scientific truths. Do we have any evidence Copernicus was murdered by the church? Right? Not unless the church was, in control of old age and somehow murdered him by letting him live out his natural years. Never persecuted. In fact, when we look at Copernicus, we'll see several high-ranking church officials were the ones who encouraged him to publish his data. He didn't want to publish his data. But we have letters that exist, not just Dan Brown. Dan Brown's fiction. This guy, David Mills, was the #1 atheist selling author in the world, best-selling atheist. This book was the bestseller before Richard Dawkins published his God Delusion book. This says it's the thinking person's answer to Christian fundamentalism. And in the corner, if you can see it, Richard Dawkins calls it an admirable work. Right? So if you know Richard Dawkins, he gives a stamp of approval. David Mills says things like this: the Christian church fought bitterly throughout its history and is still fighting today to impede scientific progress. The church is about stopping science. Galileo, remember, was nearly put to death by the church for constructing his telescope and discovering the moons of Jupiter. Nearly put to death. Where does it get that? We'll see in a minute. But you know what actually happened when Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter? The Jesuits threw a banquet for him and gave him a medal. Right? Well, that doesn't sound like nearly put to death. Right? For centuries, moreover, the church forbade human dissection, calling it a desecration of the temple of the Holy Ghost. There's the audio version. Medical research was thereby stalled for almost 1,000 years. It is no coincidence, therefore, that Christianity's longest period of sustained growth and influence occurred during what historians refer to as the Dark Ages. Historically, the church fought venomously against each new scientific advance. And we'll see why this is wrong. This is not the case with human dissection. And it's not the case with medicine. And he says those who propose scientific explanations were often tortured to death by religious authorities. Often tortured to death. So we think there's a lot of these. And we can say, okay, well, And we'll ask in a second, how many were tortured to death? What's the status of this thesis, this conflict thesis? Professional historians of science who look at the relationship between science and religion. There's a couple books, if you want to look into them. John Hopkins guy in Madison, Wisconsin, team of scholars say this warfare thesis is historically bankrupt. There's nothing to it. Lawrence Principe at Johns Hopkins University says this formulation rests on very shaky and sometimes completely fabricated foundations and was contrived largely for quite specific political, professional, and racist purposes. We'll see some of the racist purposes in a moment. All serious modern historians of science have unanimously dismissed the warfare model as an adequate historical description. Right? So as a historian of science, he's saying there's not one historian of science who says there ever was this war between science and religion. Not one, right? So to publish that as a scholar in an Oxford short introduction to the scientific revolution, you think that's something pretty non-controversial. And among historians of science, it is. There is no controversy about this among professional historians. There was never a war between science and religion. But perhaps some of you have heard that there was, right? Thus, the myth. So we're going to ask some questions after looking at this. A couple more quotes, right, in case you don't believe those guys. Colin Russell in the above book says Draper, and I think Russell's a Cambridge or was a Cambridge historian. Draper takes such liberty with history, perpetuating legends as fact that he is rightly avoided today in serious historical study. The same is true of White. We're going to talk about Draper and White, who introduced these ideas, and we'll see who he's talking about in a moment. Despite a developing consensus among scholars that science and Christianity have not been at war, the notion of conflict has refused to die. Right? So it's still out there. People still say this. The show Cosmos still says this. But we say, okay, well, David Mills says people were often tortured to death. What record do we have of people actually being tortured to death for their science? And brace yourself, because the number is quite sobering. This is how many people we have record for that were actually tortured to death for their scientific views. Right? This case is made in the Genesis of Science. Cambridge historian, I believe, James Hannam. Good book if you want to read about the history of science and faith and the Christian faith. But we say, well, what about the show Cosmos? Here's the depiction of Bruno being burned at the stake with the sinister Pope smirking as he's watching him burn. And he's burned for his belief in heliocentrism. That's what Cosmos tells us, right? But was this the case? Was it true that Bruno's belief in heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth, right, and all the planets going around the Earth, is this what got Bruno killed? It's actually not. Bruno is not original in this. He's actually quoting, when he's teaching on this, he's quoting from a Roman Catholic cardinal, Nicholas of Cusa, who himself was the inventor of concave spectacles. Right? Cusa was a scientist. He's in the 1400s. Bruno was quoting Cusa, and Cusa's book was the most popular book of the day, called On Learned Ignorance. So no one would have thought Bruno was original when he's teaching about heliocentrism. Cusa also talks about the possibility of life on other planets. So Bruno wasn't original with that. We say, okay, well, that didn't kill him, but what did kill him? Well, one thing he did do that was original was he rejected the Pope's decree of 1512 upon the discovery of the New World, discovery in quotes, 1492 by Columbus. We have these people, and the question was, are they human beings or not? Are these indigenous Americans human beings? Pope Julius II said, yes, they're also descended from Adam and Eve. They're human beings, just like we are. Bruno said, no, they're not. They're animals. Right? Bruno called sub-Saharan Africans animals, and this may be why he was executed, at least one of the reasons. He had lots of heresies. He didn't believe in the Trinity, but in terms of science, he tried to argue this scientifically. So if there's any science that Bruno was burned at the stake for, it had to do with his belief that people in the New World weren't descended from Adam and Eve, right? So the idea here that Bruno was killed for his science, Bruno was also trying to overthrow governments. Treason today is still a capital offense in some places. So we haven't changed much. You can say, well, whether it's the church killing them for treason or the state, I still don't think capital punishment is the best thing to go with. But that's an ethical argument. It's not killing someone for science, right? So it's not that Bruno wasn't killed, wasn't executed. It's just he wasn't executed for science. If he was executed for any science, it had to do with an extremely racist view that he was unique in holding. And I'm not going to support Bruno's racism in the name of science, right? So these are complex issues. None of them are simple, but we know where they began. So where does this idea begin? Well, Victorians who wanted to secularize education and science wanted to find a way to do this, so you could call it a propaganda campaign. Here's a cartoon from the Victorian age, late 1900s. We can see a church official, right, Episcopalian, Catholic, looking pretty, would you trust that guy in that cartoon? He doesn't look very friendly to me. And what's he doing to these poor little children? He's just dumping religious stuff into their heads, right? So you have things like this. Indoctrination. These folks wanted to minimize the influence of Christianity on culture, on science, and on education. And they wanted to secularize these things, to have them agnostic rather than Christian. And Christianity had a lot of influence. Some people were specifically upset with the influx of Catholic immigrants from Western Europe and from other places because of different things going on. Famines, the Irish potato famine, led to a lot of Irish people coming to the U.S. And some of these folks really didn't like Irish people. They didn't like Eastern Europeans. They didn't like Italians. Right? These are all Catholics. And some people are more anti-Catholic. Some people are anti-Christianity. And we'll look at these folks and the reasons. The two primary culprits are these individuals. John William Draper, who wrote a book that sold like hotcakes. I don't know. That's an interesting expression. Do hotcakes really sell that well? But anyway, Draper's book sold like crazy. And White's book, Andrew Dixon White, also sold like crazy. We'll talk about these books, what they said, and why we're stuck with the things that they said. This historians of science call the Draper and White thesis, the idea that science and religion have always been at war, that religion can only harm science, that when you put science and religion together, you have the oppression of science by religion. Oppression is a huge theme for all these folks, right? Christianity oppresses everyone. It's just oppressive. And it oppresses science. It oppresses, you name, fill in the blank. And Christianity will be oppressing them in these different Victorian, economic oppression. That's something that comes from Karl Marx, right? He's also at this period. Lots of flack against Christianity at this point. Draper's book says the history of science and Christianity is filled a story of ferocious theologians chasing down scientists with flaming torches to burn them. Essentially, his book is a tirade against Roman Catholicism. What are his reasons? Well, he didn't like immigrants. Draper himself was an American chemist who was the first president, I think, or one of the early presidents of the American Chemical Society, and didn't like immigrants. Himself was rather agnostic. Didn't like Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, but his favorite sister became a nun, which he thought was a betrayal to the family. He wanted nieces and nephews and such. And so there's personal reasons too. Andrew Dixon White was the founding president of Cornell University, and his motivations were, one, he was competing for money from Congress to found Cornell. He wanted, it was a land-grant university that was the first New York university that did not have a religious affiliation. So he's founding a secular school when every other school is religious, and he's telling Congress to give him money, so he needs to make an argument. So his argument is, well, whenever Christianity and science get together, we see from history that Christianity has crushed science over and over and over again. So he wrote a book to prove this, and it's a book where you start looking at its quotations and citations, And you're thinking, did he read Investigating the Natural World? But he's taking his quotes out of context, right? So he's fabricating data, he's twisting data, and he's just making up stories out of nothing. At least no one knows where he got them from. So he makes up things, or he'll find some odd person who has some crazy view, and he'll make them the center of the Christian tradition, right? And that's what he does in his book. Well, what happened was, Draper's book was part of a scientific series that was extremely popular. Yeoman's, it was a yeoman series on science, and he did the history of science. And they were the chief American purveyor of science, right? So Yeoman's was the main source that popularized science. Draper's book sold more than any of them, right? In the first 50 years, there were over 50 printings. They could not keep up with the demand. 21 editions in 15 years in the UK, and numerous translations. All kinds of translations, translated into Russian. Dostoevsky actually talks about Draper's book and finds it regrettable. We find that this book just hit everywhere, was used in the Ottoman Turkish Empire to justify their policy. Right? You have early legal documents citing Draper, and we'll see why in a moment, for the justification of the Ottoman state. And what they did in the Armenian genocide, Draper's part of that politics, right? So we have some crazy stuff going on in this period. And Draper, first of all, claimed that the Christian West descended into dark ages, while the Islamic East was a center thriving with science, human rights, and technological progress. And so Draper introduces this very stridently pro-Islamic history of science into the Western world. Actually into the Eastern world as well. This didn't exist in Islamic thought before Draper introduced it. Draper's portrayal of the history of science was eagerly adopted, translated, promoted by the ideological founders of the Ottoman Turkish state. And he talks about how Islam was very pro-evolution, that they actually believed in natural selection, that they were heliocentrists long before anyone in Western Europe was, that they were doing human dissection, lots of interesting things that we have no historical data for that Draper was claiming about Islam, right? And so we don't know where he got the stuff. It just looks like he's inventing it for lack of, not knowing better. Draper was even called the new apostle of Islam. So you see cartoons like this about Draper with, with a scimitar that says, by science's light and Islam bright, and something like that. I will tell thee so, is what Draper's saying to the Pope, right? And so it's Draper against the Pope in the name of Islam. So he was seen as very pro-Islamic. Dostoevsky laments the impact of Draper's view. You know Dostoevsky, the author of The Brothers Karamazov, and many other books at the time. He laments that Christianity was the source, that Draper's view sees Christianity as the source of ignorance, and that science had been brought to the Christian world by the Muslims. Right? So Dostoevsky is saying this is unfortunate. Right? And maybe you've heard this view that the Christian West was in the Dark Ages, and that all of our science came from Islamic sources. Right? This is a complex view. We'll talk about more when we talk about the Dark Ages. But the way it hits us is through largely myth from Draper, right? It's not, and the reality is more complex. There was a lot of science going on, we'll see next week, in the West. A lot of interesting stuff. And in the East, when we do have Islamic science, there's a lot of Christians involved too. Actually, Christians are the ones doing the translations of Aristotle and other sources. And Muslim rulers are paying them to do this in the 800s and 700s, 700s, 800s. But Christians are doing the translating. So it's complex. So to call it an Islamic Golden Age, well, they were paying, literally, the weight in gold for translations of Aristotle. But these were Syriac Eastern Christians doing the translations. And it's a lot more complex. This myth, as it is false. But these things are passed on. Things like the flat earth, that people believe the earth was flat, was invented by Draper and White. The only citation is Washington Irving's Historical Life of Columbus. where the sailors are afraid to fall off the edge of the earth. Columbus doesn't even say everyone thought the world was flat. Right? He just said the sailors thought the world was flat. But Draper and White go one step further and say, ignorant Christians all thought the world was flat. We'll see why that's just false. That's a very simple one, because no one believed it. Fabricated tales that the church banned medicine, banned human dissection, murdered Vesalius, which is just pure nonsense. Murdered Bruno for his science. We saw that one. Tortured Galileo and Copernicus. We'll see what Galileo was never tortured. We'll talk about Galileo quite a bit. And Copernicus wasn't either. Invented the myth that the church officially accepted James Ussher's date of creation as 4004 BC. So this is a case where Draper might find one Christian who had a view that no one heard of and made him the center of the Christian faith. And said this is what the Christian church has always taught as their official doctrinal date of creation. Complete nonsense. There's not one church who ever accepted Ussher's date of creation as 4004 BCE before the 1960s. Right. Actually, interesting, in the 1960s, we'll see there's an interesting shift because people accept this myth as part of their reality. And Islam and Buddhism have been typically pro-science. This is something they introduced. They loved Islam, they loved Buddhism. They thought Christianity was ignorant. But there's two myths going on, that Christianity was anti-science and that Islam and Buddhism have been typically pro-science. So that's the beginning of the Buddhism and Islam myth. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean is Thomas Henry Huxley, who's promoting this stuff in England. And he coined the term agnosticism, made Darwin sold Darwin's theory of evolution as a justification of atheism. Darwin himself was not an atheist. Darwin's a very complex story, which we'll talk about. But to the end of his days, he said, do not call me an atheist, I'm not an atheist. Right? Complex story of faith. But Darwin's theory of common ancestry was actually trying to prove the Bible right. That everyone comes from Adam and Eve. He was the only one at the time who believed that scientifically. Interesting story. Quite the opposite of probably what you heard about what Darwin was up to. But Huxley was the one who made Darwin an agnostic, an atheist. Right? Because he was an agnostic who liked Darwin's theory. So he told a guy named George Mivart one day, you can't be both a true son of the church and a loyal soldier of science. Notice the warfare imagery. Who's George Mivart? Well, he's a biologist, a Roman Catholic biologist, who believes in evolution. And he's saying, hey, Mivart, you can't have your evolution and your faith too. And Huxley, he makes this his mantra, right? Trying to get Christians to not be evolutionists, saying that evolution is inherently anti-Christian. We will look in depth at that question and see it's a more complex reality. Promotes secularization of science and society. Starts a club to do it, which he calls the X Club. They took no minutes. They didn't know. Didn't want people to know what they're talking about, right? The only rule of the X Club was that there were no rules, right? So there's some members of the X Club below. Influential agnostics whose goal was to put agnosticism in society, to change science, get religion out of science. A lot of scientists at the time were clergy, and there's their mission, to rid natural science of women, amateurs, and especially Christian clergy, and to place non-Christian secular science into the center of cultural life in Victorian England. Now that might surprise you, that statement. Wait, there's so many Christians in science? Well, most geologists were pastors at the time. Even the ones who had chairs in Cambridge were extremely devout. Lots of the naturalists, lots of the physicists. Science was a Christian enterprise before this point. Pretty, almost exclusively, you could say. Look at the history. Women in science. What's up with that? Right? The Pope founded a scientific society specifically for women. Benedict XIV, who was born in the 1600s, founded a scientific society specifically for women and appointed professors. There was a professor of anatomy at the University of Bologna that the Pope appointed. Right? And this is in the 1700s. So I said, well, wait, I never heard these stories. I never heard this. I never heard this side of the history of science. Well, that's because we are captured by these myths, right? They would give lay sermons, propaganda pieces, secular Sunday schools, trying to get agnostics into key positions all over the world, especially England, in science. Reform the Royal Society was another one of their goals. Publications. You can see publications like this. This is a magazine that was part of the X Club's aim to overthrow science. Puck magazine here. We have Reason Against Unreason. Some of the text is the luminous men of science. And you can see their names: Darwin, Huxley, Tyndall, Spencer, Newton, Boyle, Copernicus, Galileo, and others against supernaturalism, fanaticism, bigotry, and the Bible. That's what the words are below. And you can think of this list of names, right? How many have heard of Darwin, Charles Darwin, famous scientist, okay? Huxley, I just told you about. He started the X Club. How about Tyndall? Anyone know Tyndall? Okay, a couple people. Spencer, Herbert Spencer, a couple people. Newton, okay. Copernicus, Galileo, okay. So if you see what they're doing here in the PR strategy, the X Club members are Huxley, Tyndall, and Spencer. They put them among folks like Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, who are all Christians, right? And but they don't call them Christians. So positive guilt by association. Hey, I want to be a famous person of science too. Therefore, it's all these people against religious bigotry. Right? So they make themselves famous scientists through these sort of publications. People associate them with them. Not that they weren't well known in their own right. Herbert Spencer was the most popular philosopher of the day, and he was very well known. Coined the term survival of the fittest. Darwin was not the one who coined that term. But Peter Harrison, historian of science, Cambridge historian of science, says by the late 19th century, the X Club and members gained much prominence within the scientific community, carrying much influence over scientific thought. And Harrison says the enduring legacy of this group has been the perpetuation of the myth of a perennial warfare between science and religion. That's their legacy. They did their job well. The idea that science and religion have always been at war stuck. So between Draper and White and the X Club, we are stuck with this myth. Right? Undoing the myth is a lot more tedious than introducing it. And we will spend several classes talking about, well, how did the church encourage human dissection? What really happened with Galileo? What really happened with Copernicus? What really happened in these cases that Draper and White are talking about with the flat Earth? We're talking about the flat Earth next week. So if you don't believe that's true, make sure you come next week so you can see some of the data. And we'll talk about that explicitly next week. But this is an introduction to this whole spring class, things we'll be talking about. And but we can talk for a bit. And I always like us to split into groups of 6 people or 5 people, something around there. And wherever you see a group needs an extra person, you could join that one. But a couple questions to talk about. Today, there's no professional historian of science who would argue for this idea that science and religion have always been at war, yet the lie persists in popular culture, largely owing to the influence of Draper, White, and Huxley's invention of propagation. So the first question is, why do you think our culture, TV shows like Cosmos, Bill Nye, the science guy, Mr. Bill Nye had there, because he's not a PhD scientist, his science background is not that impressive, but he does lots of experiments on TV. So we can say, okay, well, why is he perpetuating this myth? He's not a historian of science. Why is he talking about it? Right? Why do we listen to him? Why do our kids watch his show and listen to this stuff? Or the Cosmos. Why do you think they still perpetuate this lie? What approach would you suggest as an effective way to counter these, right? Counter these lies when you have conversations and someone says, oh yeah, everyone always thought that the earth was flat. Right? Christians were so stupid. How would you counter that? Right? And maybe at this point you might be thinking, I don't know how to counter. I don't know the truth. Right? If that's your feeling, your response, well then then that's the point of this class, right? And so we will know the truth. So we can have these conversations and put to rest some of these lies in our own spheres of influence. So let's spend let's do about 10 minutes, perhaps, talking in small groups, get in groups of 5 or 6, talk about these questions, and then we'll meet and gather together again and see what we came up with.